2025 handbook. In fact, we're already going to start producing 2026 in a couple of weeks' time. So moving on to our agenda, after my brief introduction, I'll be handing over to each of our panelists for their opening comments. We will then dive into the discussion, and our panelists will answer some of your questions from the Q&A box. Each panelist will then give a short closing comment. In a second, you'll see the first poll appearing on your screen now. We'd like to know which type of organization you represent. This will help the panelists and I shape the discussion to make it as effective and tailored for you. So I'll just give that a minute while you let us know where you're joining us from. If you're joining us, if you've just joined in, you haven't missed anything as yet. I've just introduced today's discussion, building a more resilient civil society in partnership with the Ford Foundation. That's going to be under the microscope today. Also, learnings from the Weaving Resilience Initiative, which the Ford Foundation is leading and is currently still in progress, but there has already been learnings coming out from that initiative across the global South. Okay, great to see some new faces. Great to see a variety of guests joining us today. So that's really, really great. Keep those coming. If you've just joined us now, this is the first poll, so don't worry, you haven't missed anything as yet. So let's look at today's discussion and start getting into that. So resilience and capacity building, and I think they go hand in hand in terms of building resilience, through either the capacity of resilience or the factors which support resilience as well. So I think that's really, really key. So if we look at it across the global South, civil society organizations are really operating in increasingly complex and constrained environments, shrinking civic spaces, rising political and economic pressures, declining funding, are really placing significant strain on nonprofits and organizations at the forefront of this social change. And at the same time, the fields and the sectors that they're working in, we're seeing those coming under increasing strain. So the importance of these organizations has never been more acute than it is at the moment. So at the same time, these organizations are being expected to do more with less, to continue to grow. And as I mentioned, as they respond to that deepening inequality, climate challenges, disasters, and democratic backsliding, which we've seen, across a number of nations in recent times. And what it means to be resilient is also being redefined, not only, the ability to withstand shocks, but also the capacity to adapt, collaborate, and transform. So it's really key that strengthening civil society requires a holistic approach that goes beyond funding, encompassing institutional capacity, strategic relevance, and the well-being of people driving this work. I think that has never been more important than it is at the moment, and is often overlooked in terms of how resilient organizations are. When we talk about organizations, we sometimes lose the feel of the people behind it, which is obviously really, really key. So if we look at some of the stats that we see, over the years, Trialogue has looked at various elements of capacity building, and I think it's really important. So, the last real in-depth look we had was around 2022, where we did comparison with research we did in 2020. Now, 2020 will always be that marker of the start of the COVID pandemic. Capacity building is not a once-off intervention. It's rather a process of creating more responsive, effective, efficient, and accountable organizations through sustained and continued support. I think that's the important element for me here. So what our research in 2022 found is that 45% of the companies who participated then didn't offer any form of capacity building to the nonprofits that they worked with, right? That was up from 2020, but you know, obviously was quite a high number. No capacity building, and it was rather concerning to see that number increasing. 38% of the nonprofits, so looking at the nonprofit view, sampled didn't receive capacity building in 2022. And if we look at what NPOs were looking for, they were looking for flexible funding for internal capacity building. Was the most preferred form of capacity building by nonprofits. And this is important because, a lot of the conversations we've been having in the development space and around funding has been around, going beyond programmatic funding. And I think this is where capacity building funding comes in, where you're not just building or supporting a program as such. You're looking at how does the organization run that program, and that includes, the capacity building that they may need to run both the organization and the program as well. And then also, just from our most recent handbook, you can see financial resilience, which is also key. Is most nonprofits have less than 6 months of reserves or none at all. And many of those would have been affected by the funding cuts, the global funding cuts, not just by USAID, but we've seen a number of Western countries cutting their funding in recent years as well. So if we look at the Weaving Resilience Initiative, this is the Ford Foundation's initiative. It's a 5-year, $80 billion global program, which was launched in 2022. And its purpose is straightforward, but ambitious. Let's strengthen civil society organizations and movements across the global south so that then, don't just survive, but genuinely flourish. And it'll be interesting to see, some of that data that we did or research we did was, in 2022. Hopefully discussions like this, learning such as those from the Weaving Resilience Initiative will change, that support that corporates have for NPOs. And we see those, those capacity building efforts and that research changing from what we last noted in 2022. So in Southern Africa, it means that 6 service providers are working across 8 countries: South Africa to Eswatini, Zimbabwe, and Zambia as well, just to name a few, offering free support to over 230 organizations in areas like financial management, digital security, leadership coaching. We talk about the so-called soft skills, organizational development, and mental health as well. And we'll make those available. I'll share those in the chat for you to go and really engage with these with what's been coming out of the Weaving Resilience Initiative there. So it really is important. So now, if we go even further back to 2019, Ford Foundation survey found that organizations were grappling with a wave of Black women stepping into leadership with little support, difficulty communicating impact, and almost no capacity for monitoring and evaluation. Now, this isn't just limited to the development sector. We've seen it in the corporate space as well, and the conversations that have been happening then, in it may be further down the line in the corporate space, but it's certainly one in which we need to focus on and keep in the back of our minds as we have these conversations of resilience and support, both organizational support, but also leadership support as well. Okay, I'd now like to introduce our panelists for today. Olwetu Sizani, she's the Southern Africa Office Manager in the Regional Director's Office for the Southern African Office at the Ford Foundation. We've got Fatima Sheikh, the Executive Director at People Opposing Women Abuse, and Sarita Thomas, an Associate Trainer and Consultant at Humantum, who works with the Ford Foundation there. And we're now going to put up the second poll. In fact, if Manga will just launch our second poll there, and we can have a look at that and give you time to vote in our second poll. And in this one, we're looking at, in your experience, which of the following is the biggest barrier to nonprofit sustainability in South Africa? I'll leave that up for a bit as you go through the options as well. Just a reminder, if you joined us a bit late and may have missed some of the housekeeping, we do urge you to engage in the chat function. You'll see it on the right-hand side of your screen. It's also where you ask a question. You simply click on the green Ask a Question button. Your box will then turn green. You'll be able to type your question, send it, and I'll be able to pick it up and pose it to our panelists there. So we really get an idea of what's on your mind. What are the type of things that are being discussed in your organizations, in your sectors, amongst your groups that you may work in within your sectors as well, so that we can have those possibly answered, or to bring some interesting perspectives that we may not have thought of in that. And then just a final, just before we get into the conversation and I introduce our panelists for their opening comments, you can, as I've mentioned, the Trialogue Knowledge Hub, if you're new to the Trialogue community, you can read more about nonprofit capacity building, resilience, many other responsible business and development topics, such as collaboration and the like. On the Trialogue Knowledge Hub, you'll also be able to find all our handbook content, both our most recent handbook as well as previous editions there, case studies, learnings, and more. We really do have this free repository to build knowledge, to build capacity as well, and to share learnings within the development sector. So you can also increase your NPO's visibility through inclusion on the NPO directory. This is also featured on the Knowledge Hub. This is where we seek to, just make it easier for corporates to find NPOs who they are looking to work with, or any sectors in which they are able to work on that front. Many of you will know that we've just come off our Trialogue Business and Society conference earlier this month. You can catch up if you missed it, or if you'd like to share some of the interesting discussions that you heard. You can catch up on those discussions, the insights, the knowledge shared at the Trialogue Business and Society conference on the Trialogue website. You'll be able to find it on the conference page, all of those insights there. Share them. It's all the learnings. There was a lot to come out over the 2 days. You'll also be able to catch many, in fact, all of those discussions in full video form as well. And then just to look out, and I'll post more of this later, but won't touch on it too much at the moment, but we do have research open for our next Trialogue Business and Society Handbook, which will be launched on Giving Tuesday in December. So please look out for any for research, both NPOs and corporates as well. It really does help us to build an accurate picture of what the CSI sector in South Africa looks like, and to discuss any global trends on that front. So I'm now going to click over to our panelists. I'll start with you, Olwethu. Thank you very much for your time and for partnering with us with the Ford Foundation on this one. So, Olwethu, why was the Weaving Resilience Initiative established, and how has it evolved since 2022?
Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Sheldon, for having us on the platform. So before I start on the journey of the Weaving Resilience, I'd really like to start with 2 key lessons that we've learned as a foundation. One is that effective capacity building must be demand-driven and not supply-driven. So as you mentioned, back in 2019, we saw an increase in our partners asking for support. And then rather than assuming that we knew what was needed at the time, we conducted a couple of surveys and partner engagements to get a better understanding of the actual capacity gaps in the field. We invested time upfront to diagnose and to let the field shape the responses. As you know, capacity building is designed without the voices of those it seeks to serve. can be irrelevant and at times even extractive. So we wanted to create something as a foundation that would align with our partners' needs. At the time, obviously, we didn't know that we were at the brink of the pandemic, and that effectively capacity building would then become like more urgent than ever before. The second lesson that we learned through our engaging with partners at the time was that no piecemeal support would work. So organizations were facing a vast variety of challenges that included strategy development, financial management, communications, digital security, as well as staff well-being. And so as a foundation in terms of how we started and how we wanted to respond at the time was we then created a hub as we realized we needed to have some sort of one-stop shop that would be able to offer civil society organizations capacity building support. So in 2022, when the initiative was launched, the Office for Southern Africa identified 4 key areas as our starting point, and that was the strategy, support, financial management and governance, digital security, as well as mental wellness. Again, this is now at the tail end of what was the pandemic, having really spent time understanding the challenges that the partners were facing. The key components that we kind of looked at the time was, one, how do we expand our reach to organizations we don't typically work with? And so those are organizations that are often marginalized when people think around capacity. These are the smaller organizations or organizations that are geographically remote. And so as an office, we were quite intentional around, we wanted the offering to be open to partners that were outside of the Ford Foundation partner base. Because to your point, with our partners, the assumption was we do generally offer long-term general support funding, so they may have access to resources that they could use for capacity building. So we wanted to access partners that wouldn't ordinarily access support. We also wanted to create a sort of hub, so pull together various partners, so Humentum, SGS, Digital Society, Africa, that would then create this hub that would not only come together to offer the support, but we could learn together, we could co-create, we could design together, and we could then constantly be feeding back to civil society what was actually needed. Another key approach in terms of how we saw capacity building was how do we invest in capacity or in supporting organizations in a way that gave them the support, that gave them the capabilities. So all of our support was generally very individualized and really looked at how do we expand the offering to more people in the organization so that should there be staff turnover, organizations still have resource persons within organizations that can help keep the work. That when it comes to strategy, it wasn't about consultants coming in, writing up your strategy and wishing you well, but rather it was investing time into a co-creation space where we could teach or support organizations develop their own strategies. This we felt would be a more sustainable way of supporting organizations. And then I think the other thing was, and then I think in terms of the evolution of the intervention or the evolution of the Weaving Resilience initiative for our office is that we had 2 sort of major evolutions. The first one was when we started, like I said, we had the 4 areas of support, but over time we realized we needed to add 2 more, and the 2 layers that we added was around leadership and coaching, and then this again was based on how we were engaging and how we were engaging with partners and what we were learning around a leadership gap and the real need to support leaders either in transition or leaders that had taken over organizations after what was a devastating COVID pandemic. And so leadership support was added as part of the Weaving Resilience offering. The second one was offering organizational development with accompaniment. Again, this was designed for organizations that were saying, yes, we need support, but we weren't able to do like just the strategic development, organizations that needed you to walk a much longer journey with them. So this was the second sort of offering that was made available to organizations. Then the second major evolution for the initiative was that we then had to open our offering to other groups. So initially when we started, we said we weren't offering the services to Ford partners. Over time, we realized that actually some of our partners were in need of the services that were being offered by the hub. So Ford partners were allowed to also get services from the hub. And then I think the second, which is really unique for the foundation, was that we were able to extend the Weaving Resilience offering, especially the leadership component, to government officials, where previously the foundation would not have provided any direct support to government officials. Again, these are not like the elected officials, but officials that are offering direct services to communities as officials. They were also allowed to receive services from the hub. And I think to date, I mean, the foundation has really been intentional about learning throughout the Weaving Resilience journey, and across all the 8 offices that have been participating. Learning has really been central in how we are able to build resilience and listen to what our partners are really requesting for. And as you mentioned, we have successfully to date supported over 500 organizations across the Southern Africa region. So that is South Africa, Namibia, Swaziland, Lesotho, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi. Thank you, Sheldon.
Thank you so much, Olweto, and really sets the scene for the Ford Foundation's involvement, your thinking, what you've done already, and really sets the the base for the conversation. I'd now like to move to Sarita. Sarita, thank you very much for joining us today. How has Humantum supported the Weaving Resilience initiative in Southern Africa, and how have you translated the initiative's vision into practical support?
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Sheldon. Thank you for the question and being part of the panel. I think for Humantum, who does a lot of work around resilience, we see ourselves as a global partner for social good. And we work with a lot of organizations to look at their strategies, their structures, to help them to achieve their real mission. This partnership with Ford Foundation was a great opportunity for us to really work with organizations in Southern Africa. In my own kind of capacity, I've been part of Legacy Mango Humantum for plus minus 25 years, and we've been involved in a lot of capacity development projects across the globe. So we were very excited to join Ford and the other organizations building the capacity of social impact organizations. So how did we put it in practice? For us as Humantum, we focused on 3 different areas: financial management, financial sustainability, and governance. And it's those 3 areas that really helps with the financial continuity and the financial security of an organization. So we've built a program for each one of those areas that basically involved some training, consultancy. We've set up community of practice, and we also provided a resources library to all these organizations. And we started to work with the organization by first identifying their needs, their gaps. Which area do they need support in? I think Olweto already mentioned it. It needed to be demand-driven and not supply-driven, that we don't just want to offer something and they feel they have to take it. So we've really worked with these organizations, have various discussions to identify their needs. Where can we come in, be a trusted partner, not being seen, so often in capacity development projects, you get seen as the auditor or you get seen as the person that's sent by the donor, whether you can get funding or not. But we really wanted to be a kind of trusted partner to work with them to build their capacity and skills, really listen to their needs and get their commitment. So usually we've done a kind of in-depth assessment. I always start with a self-assessment because it's always good to get an understanding how an organization perceives themselves, and then work with them on an in-depth kind of assessment, identify weaknesses and gaps based on best practices and minimum standards. And after we've gone through this process is then to give them feedback, which I think is just as important, because often I will hear that, oh, we just had another assessment, we just had a due diligence, but we never get feedback. So really to sit and spend time with the organization, give them feedback, and then agree what is the best kind of process, best kind of support that we can provide them moving forward. As mentioned, we had the 3 different areas that we as Humentum focused on: financial management. Going back to the basics of financial management, we split that up by looking at financial planning, accounting records, accounting systems, financial monitoring and reporting, as well as internal controls. We refer to it as your kind of 4 building blocks of financial management, and all of that is needed for financial control. So based on the kind of assessment, we will determine whether the organization do have any gaps and weaknesses in financial management. The second kind of option is financial sustainability. I think that's, such a key area for all organizations. And we really go back to look at those 3 key questions: where are we now, where are we going, how do we get there? In my experience, organizations are really good in having a strategic plan, but not a financing strategy, how to fund that strategic plan. And I think that's also what's been really good with working with other partners in this hub, that maybe SGS provided the strategic plan, and then we will come in and work with the finance strategy. And then lastly, looking at good governance. What kind of, how do you governing and guide your organization to ensure you do achieve your mission and objectives at the end of the day?
Okay. Thank you, Sarita. And I think it's such an interesting perspective in terms of the support you offer, both obviously the Ford Foundation in terms of their vision, and then also to the civil society organizations. And what I love is, where you mentioned it's demand driven. It's almost that design thinking. So the same way we talk about before you go into a community, involving the community in the solution, and not just, even with the best intentions, enforcing it from top down, but really working with the organizations in terms of understanding what are their most critical needs, what is the context within their work, within which they're working there. Fatima, I'd like to come to you now. So Fatima Sheikh is the Executive Director of People Opposing Women Abuse. Fatima, from your perspective, I mean, obviously you're a third element in this. As an organization receiving support, how was the Weaving Resilience Initiative, how's it benefited Power? And what is the context in which you were operating before the initiative? Fatima, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Sheldon, for the opportunity and to share on this platform. Before the Weaving Resilience Initiative, Power, like many organizations in the GBV sector and broader South African civil society, was operating under significant and ongoing pressure. Demands for services was increasing, social challenges were deepening, and organizations were expected to respond to increasingly complex realities while operating within a highly constrained environment. For many nonprofits in South Africa, resilience is not an abstract concept. It's about trying to sustain critical services, retain staff, maintain organizational stability, and quite literally keep the lights on amid funding uncertainty and growing social needs. One of the challenges within the sector is that funding environments are often highly rigid and compliance driven, and it places significant emphasis on short-term outputs and administrative requirements. While far less attention is given to long-term organizational sustainability and well-being. Organizations are expected to bear enormous social responsibility while frequently operating under conditions of instability and in the midst of ongoing crisis management, and that is the reality of NGOs. That's what we do. What made the Weaving Resilience initiative different was its recognition that resilience is not only about a program delivery, and I think this is where it differs so vastly from other funding initiatives that we've had the opportunity of engaging with. It was also about it was about institutional strengthening. It was looking at organizational health and well-being of the people doing the work. The initiative moved closer towards a more trust-based approach. The organization was given space to identify their own realities, their own vulnerabilities and priorities, rather than having support imposed through a one-size-fits-all model. And I think for us, going through that process was a big learning, and it was us kind of dictating our needs and where we were at, and kind of working from that perspective. Through the initiative, Power received support to strengthen our financial system. So we worked with very closely with Sarita, looking at our financial policies and internal processes, as well as support around strategic planning and human resources, systems and policies. Other areas, these areas are often invisible within the nonprofit sector, yet they are critical to accountability, sustainability, governance, and long-term impact. I think, we got into the habit of operating on autopilot, and very little attention was given to looking at your sustainability and your systems that actually make the organization function. And because we were so crisis driven, and I think that was kind of just taking a step back and looking critically at how we do the things that we do in a more systematic and in a way that makes sense, without kind of catching your tail all the time. Another important aspect of this work is recognizing the emotional toll that the long-term social justice work can have on our staff and the organization. I think many people work within the GBV sector and have been exposed to years of trauma, crisis, and systemic injustice. I mean, people have been with the organization for like 27 years, have been part of the history, biology, geography of the organization, and that, they internalize all of that. And we never ever look at that, as service providers. We social workers are the worst clients you can get. So, they'll never see a social worker themselves or seek therapy, and that makes it all the more difficult. So over time, organizations can internalize this kind of strain in ways that affect morale and well-being, as well as the organizational culture. And I think this Weaving Resilience program highlighted the fact that you need to actually stop, slow down, and think critically about what you do, how you do, and what is needed to actually, what you need to put in place to actually function in a healthy environment. So these are conversations that were very difficult to have, but very necessary. And it became urgent because you obviously want to retain the people in the organization, but burnout is real. So for us, the Weaving Resilience Initiative helped create space for organizations like ours to begin addressing some of these deeper institutional pressures, and also looking at strengthening the systems needed for long-term sustainability. In many ways, it offered the organization an opportunity to not simply survive, but to stabilize, to reflect, to strengthen internally, and to build a more resilient foundation for the future. You know, we've been around for 47 years, and things kind of evolve without a lot of thought. You know, it kind of, you just go with the flow. But I think having to go through these processes was actually quite heartening. And for some who were part of the process, it was the first time that they engaged so thoroughly with these kind of initiative, with this initiative in particular, where, you know, we needed to interrogate why we do what we do, and have it make sense, but also to do things once and not kind of, you know, reinvent the wheel. So I think for us that was a very big learning as well.
Thanks very much, Fatima. And I think that really, allows us to, get the perspective of an organization that's been part of this process, the realities that you face and what it's possibly helped you with. If I could now ask all my panelists to switch on their cameras and their mics as we move to the discussion part of the conversation. I'd also like us now just to launch our third poll. How would you describe the capacity building support your organization or your funded partners currently receive? I'll just leave that up for a minute as you vote. It's also an opportunity just to reflect back on the previous poll, and how you have voted on that. Thank you very much for those who had joined possibly during the opening commentary. I see you did vote on the first poll, so that also moved us along. But if we look at the second poll, which really gets into the subject matter of today's discussion. So in your experience, which of the following is the biggest barrier to non-profit sustainability in South Africa? Right? 79% of you overwhelmingly voting for inconsistent or short-term funding cycles. And I think that comes with its own stresses, right? In terms of keeping the organization going, keeping the program going, offering the right type of support that funding can help with to both staff and obviously the beneficiaries of the program as well. 5% voting high staff turnover and burnout, which I really love about this initiative and the conversations and focus areas that it's starting in terms of capacity building, right? Moving us along from, just the hard skills that we often think about in terms of the support that civil society organizations or NPOs need there. So weak financial management systems, 1% of you voting there. I think Sarita touched on that in terms of how that is addressed as part of the initiative. Limited strategic planning capacity. I think that's really important as well, and Fatima touched on that, being able to pause at certain times and look possibly, a bit further than the immediate needs. Although it is, we have to acknowledge that it can be very difficult in situations where you're working with limited resources, where the need from the community is so dire and so acute that long-term strategic planning may seem at times like a luxury. 2% voting lack of mental health and well-being support for staff. I think that would turn into, also links very closely to high staff turnover and burnout. And then digital vulnerability and security risks, I think not high at the moment for organizations there. So let me just look at how the third poll has gone. How would you describe the capacity building support your organization or your funded partners currently receive? 43% of you voting. We received no formal capacity building support. So that would speak to some of the findings that we found in our Trialogue research, as that I'd mentioned during the presentation from 2022. So it doesn't seem, at least from the SNAP poll, that much has changed since then. We received once-off workshops or training sessions that came out in our previous research as well. And then at 15%, we receive, just down to 14 now, as you continue to vote, we receive ongoing but narrowly focused support. Example, financial reporting only. 16% saying we are unsure what support is available to us. And hopefully through a discussion like this, we address that element of the the uncertainty at the very least. So I think that gives us a very good picture of where our audience is at in terms of their organizations and what they face and what they need. Or where to, in terms of what we've seen coming out of those polls, how does that align to the work that the Ford Foundation has done since the launch, but I imagine even before the launch of Weaving Resilience initiatives, which would obviously have fed into it?
Thanks for that, Sheldon. I think it aligns, in terms of just hearing people say, we don't know what is available to us. I think that is also something that the foundation has learned in terms of how do we actually let people know what resources are available. And I think Fatima touched on it, and Sarita as well, just around the importance of building trust relationships with your partners. Through the initiative, we didn't only have to build trust with the hub partners that were offering the service, but we've always had to maintain a relationship of trust that extends to the partners that receive funding from Ford. And what this allows is for organizations to be able to approach the foundation and say, this is where I need help. And I think organizations are only able to be vulnerable once those relationships have been established. And I think also funders or donors being willing to, without punishment, hear where organizations are struggling. Because I think people don't approach funders around what their capacity needs are, because they fear that if I tell you my funding is going to be retracted, or I'm no longer going to get funding, or it compromises future funding. And I think a key component of the Weaving Resilience initiative was that there were no conditions. It was open to partners that weren't for grantees, and upfront, organizations were informed that you're not expected to meet any donor requirements. We have no expectations of you after this. And it also doesn't guarantee or mean you'll be getting funding. So there was an honest relationship upfront. But I think the most important thing is really just being able to establish trust-based relationships with your partners, so that if and when they do have needs, they're able to approach you without fear. Thanks, Sheldon.
Alweto, I want to stay with you quickly, just in terms of what was the impetus, or what was the, I suppose, the spark that changed from possibly a supply-driven perspective to, as you mentioned, a demand-driven one? Because we know it's in a lot of foundation and corporate and philanthropic support, that there is still very much a supply driven perspective that maybe comes from strategies that the organizations have. What was the spark in terms of that change?
From the foundation, we really wanted to offer organizations support that they needed, right? And we got to a place where we understood that organizations have organizational agencies. They know their needs. And as a funder, we're responsible for supporting or resourcing rather than prescribing what it is that organizations are needing. So as Fatma had initially said, how organizations are onboarded onto the Weaving Resilience Initiative is that there is an initial, very comprehensive diagnostic that's done. And the idea about the diagnostic is to create opportunity for organizations to step back and to evaluate their own organization, to really reflect on what it is that I need. But I think a key component, and this goes back to my first lesson around no piecemeal support is relevant, can work, was that we weren't saying to organization, you then have to pick this support versus this support. We were saying, let's first map out all of the areas where you need support. Then what the diagnostic, the initial assessment will help us to do, will help us determine where to start. Do we start with strategy? Do we start with mental wellness of your organization? Do we start with digital security? And the reason that the foundation had then taken the strategy of working in a hub was that within the hub, organizations are then after we've finished your strength, your capacity, or your mental wellness support, we're able then to move you to the next area of support. So I think it was this understanding that organizations like ourselves, right, are complex. They're faced with multiple challenges, and therefore we have to give them the space and allow their agency to tell us what it is that they need, and then facilitate and resource how that support can be received.
Okay. Now, Sarita, I want to come to you. So we sometimes have organizations thinking what they need, but there may actually be something else that they need before that. How do you navigate that gap in terms of, what highlighting what they may need in the near future versus what they think they may need at that stage?
I think it comes back to what I said earlier on, is that kind of assessment that needs to be done. Because we do find it quite often that people don't know what they don't know. They think they have good systems in place. They're very quick to say, but we have good accounting records. We have good supporting documents. So we have financial control. But there's much more towards financial control than just supporting documents. So it's going back to have that initial kind of assessment with your partners, with your clients. And as mentioned, what we are doing is we first let them do a self-assessment on how they perceive themselves. And then I take that same assessment and I just go deeper. And quite often, there's a lot of that aha moments. Oh, I didn't know that's actually what's meant by this system or this policy or by this question. And we link it then with good practices, minimum standards, and show them of what is really needed within your organization. So it's not a matter of just giving them a kind of a checklist and ask them this needs to be implemented. It's really working through that assessment, the best practices with them to get the understanding and in a way identify for themselves where they do have gaps. Because it does come back to quite often people think their systems are good and they have the minimum in place. And it's not until you start to have that conversation and show them examples. I found that quite important as well. Show them the various different financial templates for reporting or for board meetings or whatever the case might be, that they start to have a better understanding of really, this is where our weaknesses are.
So Rita, in terms of, a lot of these elements are interlinked, right? So if you've got a lack of organizational development, it often means, you've got a lack of financial skills, and that then, snowballs into uncertainty in terms of the operation of the NPO as a going concern. From your perspective, how are all of these tied in to the mental health and well-being, to the burnout that is experienced, and especially working with, a lot of the development institutions? You're either working with vulnerable children, you're working with poor children. In your instance, you're working with women who've been abused, their children may have seen that abuse as well. So there's a great level of trauma in the beneficiaries that you and survivors that you are working with, before you even come into the organizational stress that you may face.
I think part of this question is also for Fatima, that's working more on, directly with some of these clients. But I think for me, one key kind of observation is definitely that capacity. We have so much to do. How can we get to everything at the end of the day? And quite often what we see is with financial resilience, financial management, people work quite often in silos. That it's only finance people that work on the finances or that's concerned about the financial sustainability. And with all my consultancies, I think that's always one of the key areas I emphasize is teamwork. We need to be able to work together. All of us need to have a better understanding what's happening in the projects, what's happening in the finances, what gets presented to the boards, that we have a better understanding of how we could support each other as well. Because financial sustainability and good financial management is not up to the finance manager. It's everyone's responsibility. We need to really understand our role within that area and how we can support each other to be more successful. And I think that then helps with that overall kind of burden, to get everything done and feel overwhelmed quite often. If we start to see that we work as a team and everyone has their bits and pieces, it's much easier then to manage some of these responsibilities we have as well. And I think Fatima can add more with, the people that she works under distress as well.
Yes, I think Fatima, especially from your perspective, as from the organizational perspective, what is it like? I mean, we obviously getting hints of it coming through from the polls. We can extrapolate, but as someone who works in the organization, not just the organizational stress, but as we mentioned, the survivors and the traumatic experiences that they deal with. How does the organization, how does it all link together, and how do you face that reality?
So, Sheldon, I mean, there's a number of ways of looking at this. Remember, organizations are staffed with people who have trained within a particular methodology. So, the bulk of our staff are made up of social workers and social auxiliary workers. And when you get into an organization, you think my job is to just do counseling. And your job evolves over time because as you grow within the organization, your roles also change within the organization. You become a manager, you're expected to manage people, you're expected to manage budgets. And I think for us, the learning with Sarita was that the budget does not belong to the finance manager. The budget belongs to the people who actually implement. So it was teaching managers how to actually read a budget or how to plan their work. And it was about thinking very deliberately about what you do. So making sure that your activity captured within a budget had a line item. So for example, if you were running a workshop, you needed to plan for the workshop. You needed to have a budget for your materials. You needed to have facilitation costs, venue costs. And people didn't realize that those were all important things to consider. And remember, as a social worker or social auxiliary worker, you're not trained in project management. You're trained as a social worker. So your job evolves. And there's a big skills gap between kind of running an organization and looking at systems versus being a social worker. The social workers do casework, group work, community work. That's what we train to do. And I think having to kind of, break the autopilot button is actually an important thing that we should consider because people kind of just were on autopilot and it became your finance manager's responsibility to manage your budget. And then people would say, but I want to buy t-shirts, and says, but you didn't cost for t-shirts. oh, and we want to do an evaluation, but you've never costed for an evaluation. So I think these are all things that people learn in hindsight. And I think for us, this process that we have been through was to kind of stop and evaluate how we were doing what we were doing. But it also made us a lot smarter, because what it meant was that you have a real understanding of the money behind the program, and the resources behind the program. Because people just assume that things are going to happen, and if they ask for things, it's the finance manager's responsibility to make sure it happened. And when it couldn't happen, it was like, are you hiding money from us? Because like they'd say, but we know we got this amount of funding, why can't we have the money? And it's like there's a line item for these things. And it's kind of recapacitating people to think more strategically within a system, understanding, but also to take responsibility. Because I think social workers will say, my responsibility is to run the program, yours is to do the money. No, actually, for you to do it better and smarter, you need to understand what needs to go into your program and to plan better. So it's teaching people project management skills, teaching people to plan better, teaching people to be more thoughtful in how they want to do. It's not just kind of starting something and then thinking, oh, but we could be doing this, and oh, that would be a nice to have. And as the program unfolds, you want more, but you haven't thought about this in advance. So it's kind of stop, think about your outcomes, think about your outputs, think about where do you want to get. It's not just let's start the journey and see where it takes us, that kind of situation.
Thanks for that, Fatima. And I want to go to some of the questions, and thank you to our audience for engaging with us, sending us those questions, engaging on the chat. Just a reminder that to ask a question, you've got the chat box. Just click on the green Ask a Question button. Your box will turn green. Type your question and hit the arrow, and it'll come through to me here. Kerry, thank you for your question. I think Kerry asking, how is capacity built proactively when demand is the used signal? Is there a need for better forecasting? I think, Sarita, you answered that in terms of, going in, often there are the known unknowns, or a lack of appreciation of some of the elements, to make a successful and a resilient organization. And that's where, your organization comes in, Humantum, and obviously the Ford Foundation, in terms of what type of capacity needs to be built to make the organization more resilient and stronger on that front there. Owete, I want to come to you, and then Sarita. Yes, come in.
Sorry, can I just add something there? I think also what is very important is the timing of the capacity development, is that you check it is the right time for the organizations. I've had clients that said, can't we maybe just delay it for 3 or 6 months? And they shouldn't be penalized when they're upfront and honest, they don't have the capacity now. So, it is maybe, to come back on a later stage when it's more convenient for them as well. I think that's also a very important element.
Yeah, I think that really is, being in the right place, to so to speak, for the capacity building to start. Okay, Owete, I want to come to you, and Sarita, you can also give us your thoughts on this. And a question here from Bright, saying, is it not the right time to explore different operating models for the sector, given its current profile characterized by many players, often underfunded, and funding cycles that threaten survival? So I think, Brighton saying, as more of the civil sector organizations proliferate and grow, is it not actually to the detriment of the sector? Or what's the Ford Foundation? What's your thinking on that, rather?
I think one of the key things that with Weaving Resilience, especially now where we are, is really also being able to challenge funders around collaboration. how do we begin working together, pulling resources to offer the capacity building support versus the models that essentially say, we as a Ford Foundation will only support our partners and kind of claiming that autonomy over the services or over the organizations we seek to support. So one of the things that I think through the Weaving Resilience we've been able to pilot was in partnership with the Constitutionalism Fund. They had a cohort of some of their partners that required support, and they were able to contribute funding towards the initiative to say, we're not going to establish our own capacity building facility. We're not going to recreate what already exists and is open to all civil society partners. Instead, we're actually going to contribute towards this existing work, and organizations can be supported. So I do think that organizations on the ground emerge based on need and based on constituencies. But I think the responsibility lies with those with resources to begin thinking about creative ways in which they can start working more intentionally together. I think to think together, to learn together, so that we're able to resource and provide really adequate and long-term support to various civil society organizations.
Sarita, your perspective on this. I mean, one of the things that and you touched on a point there, Orwetu, is around collaboration. And one of the driving themes at Trialogue in the near to midterm is around how do we get sector collaboration going, right? For those very reasons, where you don't need to, at each organization, reinvent the wheel. You want to have learnings, which is, I suppose, part of, our capacity building and knowledge sharing, so that, those organizations that do come up, or those that are already in the thing, can learn from what others have done, both the good and what hasn't worked out as well. Sarita, from your perspective, and I think, I always feel this is a double-edged sword. I get that as more organizations grow and proliferate or come up, yes, there is funding decisions can only go so far, or support decisions can only go so far. There's only so many organizations you can work with. But on the other hand, our needs in the country, in the region, in the global south are so, are growing every year, that, you need these organizations, someone to say, well, you know what, in my community, I'm going to be the person or the organization that comes up. So where is that balance between, having organizations coming up and being established versus, getting that right optimum? Okay, let's rather collaborate, or let me join an existing organization rather than trying to start my own.
I think it's a very good and difficult question, Sheldon, because I think, quite often each and every organization wants to have the limelight. They want to make the difference. They want to, come forward and specialize in a specific area. And I think what we've seen in the sector globally as well is, because of the funding restraints the last 2 years, we're starting to see more and more mergers or more partnerships. And I think that's needed for the organization, because together we can be much stronger. And you can really, I think, do more with the money by working together. Because quite often, being a startup organization, being an existing organization, your overheads is quite heavy. And that quite often restrict you also to do certain things. So I think there's definitely room for more collaborations and partnerships, really to go and do your homework. I think I always say this as part of financial sustainability. Before you just go and submit proposals, go and really do your work, do your research. Who are the funders out there than just submitting call for proposals, just reacting on that? It needs more than that for you as an organization to grow. And that's the same for me with collaborations and partnerships. Before you decide to start a new project or an organization or a new movement, really go and do your homework and have discussions. I think for us in the sector, we shouldn't see each other as competition, which quite often we do. If we want to have a better civil society out there, we need to work together, and we need to see, what is my unique value proposition that I can bring to the table, that we can work together. So I think, yes, there's definitely room for more partnerships and collaborations, but also in terms of who do we work with? It's you need to do more mapping, more scoping, more research to really find the right partner for you. Then otherwise, we always are in that survival mode. And we always, just thinking month to month, short term. Is really answering the question, who are we? What do we want to achieve? And how are we going to do it? And that's not necessarily by ourselves.
Thanks for that, Sarita. Fatima, I want to turn to you, and it's a statement from Kathleen, but I think there's a question in there, and certainly is important when we look at the part of the so what of initiatives like this. So Kathleen Day says, a lack of internal capacity building is the greatest barrier to nonprofit sustainability, but it's not on the pole. And I think where the question for me comes in is how are systems built while the capacity building is happening, so that the organization itself can drive internal capacity building, right? So almost like the each one teach one. So I've been on the course, or I've got support from the corporate or from Humantum or Ford Foundation, and I'm able to, in my organization or others that I work with, I'm able to build that capacity. Does power work with one eye on what can we take from this so that we can continue this in our own organizational development?
I think Kathleen is spot on when she says that capacity building is not kind of central to what we do and how we think. But it is important. And the lesson that we've learned through this experience is the importance of making sure that we keep this on our agenda and on our radar, because it makes us a lot smarter in moving forward. I don't think, I mean, we work in a very resource constrained organized setting where, these resources, if we had to pay for this kind of support that we've received, we wouldn't be able to afford it, in all honesty. And so we were very grateful for that, because what it had meant was that there was opportunity to redo things in a very systematic way, but also to tailor it to our needs. So we went through the whole process of really looking at our finances. We went through a strategic planning for the organization, as well as looking at our human resources and capacity building. I mean, the way in which our staff operate, what are the job descriptions, where they where the gaps in our policies. And it meant it's a very intense process. It's a painful process. There's a lot of lessons to be learned, but I think it's a very worthwhile process, and I think it must be kept on the agenda, because it makes your organization smarter. Donors like that because they ask those hard questions. They ask the questions of your policies, your procedures, your risks. Have you considered the risks in the organizations? How do you mitigate those risks? They look at, things around your governance structures, things that we just assume you have a board, but what is the role of your board? Where is there, crossover? What risk does your board pose? What risk does your management team pose? And making it such that, if you have these things in place, then you can operate a lot more efficiently and focus on the work. But remember, the people that are employed in the organization don't start off as project managers. They start off as social workers. They start off as trainers. They start off as auxiliary workers, and they kind of evolve into doing those things. So, this is stuff that universities and institutions don't focus on. So this is an add-on learning, and it's an ongoing learning, and it's part of your own development as an individual. But it also, develops the capacity of your staff to do their work better, to report better, to think about your impact in a more meaningful way. It's not just about, oh, I offered counseling to 50 women. So what? What was the impact of that? Could you have done this better? Have you considered, other things that you could have done? Have you looked at your methodology so it makes you smarter as an organization, and it also means that you are keeping abreast of the trends globally. So you work locally, but you have to think globally. And civil society organizations don't have that luxury to actually and engage, because we always running, we always toying, we always busy fighting a fight. We want to keep SAPs in line, we want to go and toy outside the court, we're fighting with the Department of Social Development. But it means that you have to kind of just plan for it, and when Sarita says timing is important, yes, a lot of time needs to go into the process, but if you don't invest that time, then this is a wasted exercise. And initially when we thought about, every week we're going to have to meet with Sarita for the next, I don't know how many weeks, and it means like kind of just stopping and doing, your other mundane things, you think, oh my God, but once you're in it and you're looking at things, it also answers some of the questions that was in your mind, but you never asked it outright. So I think, it's a painful process, but it's a worthy process, and it should happen.
Sheldon, could I make a quick addition to what?
Yes, of course. A lively discussion.
I was just about to say, just as I think I said in the beginning, and maybe it's a challenge to funders and donors, is as you think about offering capacity development to organization or capacity building support, don't, as far as possible, don't offer it to a single person. I think what tends to happen is that support is limited to management or senior management or the executive director, which then centralizes the knowledge as far as possible. And I think this is what we've learned, especially when working with community-based organizations or smaller entities, is that you have a high staff turnover. And so when that one person that you train leaves, then it means you're going to need to reinvest. So as far as possible, and I think this is what we tried to do with the initiative, is one, make sure that the initiative is catering to the organization and invite as many of the organization employees that are able to participate. And so that kind of ensures that everybody travels with you. And I think as both Sarita and Fatima were explaining, that even budgeting shouldn't be limited to the finance staff. Everybody should understand. So I think it's about being willing, and I know there's funding constraints in many instances, but being willing to open the support to as many individuals in organizations, because that's also what builds sustainability and resilience. Thanks, Sheldon.
Thanks so much. Sarita, I want to come to you. There's a question, I suppose, maybe to give us a bit more understanding on maybe what the problem is, right? Nomvula Dlamini saying, one of the trends she observes working with the formalized civil society organizations is there's less funding support for genuine capacity building. And I think we've seen that come through either in the Trialogue research, anecdotally, and obviously in the experiences that have been shared here today. She asks, why is there less funding support for capacity development to build internal organizational capacity that will lead to resilient organizations? Now, Fatima, you also touched on the importance of internal organizational capacity building, but I think it goes back to to the funding question, and which I touched on earlier. We know that there's a lot of funding for programmatic work and initiatives, and again, those are easier to then report back on a yearly basis, right? So when corporates are getting their funding reports, or when NPOs are feeding back to their corporates, it's easier to say, well, this is what we've done over the year. This is how many, beneficiaries we've treated or, seen and the like. But it's a bit harder with organizational development. So why is there, just to build on what I've said, Sarita, and maybe help Nomvula understand why there's less funding for support for capacity building?
I think this is more a question for the funder than the person that's advocating for that as well. I do think, with the funders, they what I always say is, remember, funders have their own objectives as well. They get their funding from somewhere else as well. So impact is everything for them. But that doesn't make it right. I'm a big advocate that you do need to make the case that you do need money for organizational capacity development. You need money to cover your administrative cost. Because at the end of the day, you are a business like anyone else that need to be able to pay your officers, but part of that is staff development as well. So I think with a lot of funders, and I tend to see that less with foundations, but more your institutional kind of funders, they have that direct link to the government policies, the government objectives, impact on what do we do with the money. So the funding is very, very restricted. Where with a lot of foundations that I work with, you have more that flexibility. And you can make a case, why do I need money for staff development, for building the capacity? Because without a strong organization, you cannot implement a good project or an effective, successful project. So it is interlinked at the end of the day that you need both type of funding. And I think, like I said, I can't speak on behalf of funders because I'm on the other side that does a lot of advocacy work on this. But I think I come back to what I said earlier on. There are a lot of funders that wants to support you, that believes in the work you do and building your own capacity. So it's once again looking for the right funder, looking for the right partnerships. And that means donor mapping, donor scoping. And they are out there. They might be less than your big institutional kind of funders, but really make an effort to find the right partnership that will back you and help your organization to grow. Because the stronger you are as an organization, the stronger projects and the bigger impact you are going to have as well. But I think, a lot of the traditional kind of funders are restricted on how they can or what type of funding they can provide you with. But I always say is, do make a case for it. Do ask for that money. Don't just shy away from it because it was not in the framework. Start the discussion and negotiate that type of funding as well. Than just accepting this funder is not going to give us this money. You never know if you don't ask. That's always my attitude. Make the case why it's needed and important for you.
Okay. I'll wait to a question here for you, and we often get it, when we looking at capacity building and support for NPOs, is around access for NPOs in rural areas or outside your main city centers, right? So how easy or accessible is the Ford Foundation for organizations operating outside big cities? And that's from Xolani Kunene.
Thanks for that, Sheldon. I think with the Weaving Resilience Initiative, we were quite intentional about actually seeking out organizations that were not in the city center. We were initially, for the first couple of years, were explicit around not actually offering support to partners that receive funding from the Ford Foundation, which is why many of our partners actually went to places in Swaziland. I mean, with digital security support, it's difficult to offer that service remotely. So our partners went down to Swaziland. They've been in Mozambique. They went up to Malawi, Zambia, and some of these areas, it was about do we facilitate with tried working with partners in country to perhaps bring groups together? Alternatively, also go to where the partners were. So I think with this particular initiative, we're very, very intentional about reaching community organizations where they were. And really, it's been at the tail end that we've opened support to organizations at the Ford Foundation, supports that are more urban or city based, but largely the support was more to organizations in more remote or geographically remote areas that were supported.
Okay. Thanks for that, Olwet, and Palani, I hope that that answers your question there. So wow, quick time check. I think this webinar has really gone amazingly well. But yeah, and you know, time has flown. We're already in the last 5 minutes. So I want to turn to the closing comment from each of our panelists. But just before we do that, two things from our side. If we just launch the final poll, for us to get a sense of, you know, where we are, which of the following best describes where your organization currently stands on building holistic resilience support into your CSI or funding strategy. So I think this is more for the funders, but it does give us a sense of where organizations stand and where they're thinking about that. And hopefully this conversation has moved that along. You know, has moved that along. So I'll just leave that up a bit. Olwethu, let me come to you first for your closing comment. What would you like to leave, you know, funders, civil society organizations, foundations with, you know, following today's conversation?
I think three key things from my side is one, be willing to invest the time before you invest the money, especially to foundations. Take time to understand your partner's needs, engage them in designing and creating processes of support for your organizations. And then I think also be open to learning. I think there's many sort of frameworks that we've already adapted, and we assume that these need to remain. I think be always open to learning and adapting, and as far as possible be flexible in providing support and engaging with your partners. And then I think this more specifically to funders and donors, be willing to invest in the long term. I think unlike maybe some of the corporate deliverables, social change does take time. And so it does need that as funders or foundations, that we put on our long-term glasses as we invest in organizations, especially the what I'd call frontline organizations that are really working to build the societies in which we want to live. Thanks, Sheldon.
Thank you so much for that, Olwethu. And I see the votes coming in. Thank you very much. 33% saying we are a nonprofit looking for this kind of support ourselves. And I hope, you know, through this conversation and through these type of conversations, we move that along. 25% saying we already do this and are looking to deepen our approach. Well done to you and your organization, and you know, and good luck on those efforts to deepen it there. We are interested, but do not know where to start. I'll ask Olwethu just to share us with some details, contact details, as well as Sarita as well, and we'll include that in the write-up where you'll be able to get that. And if you need to reach out and find more information, we'll share that as well as some of the Weaving Resilience Initiative literature that's come out already, or content that is available. We see the value, but face internal resistance or budget constraints. And I think that's a reality we've got to realize as well. Before I go to Sarita and Fatima for their closing comments, we've just posted the rate the session. If you could rate it, it really does help us to get a good sense of how valuable you found the session and what we can do to improve it over there. So Sarita, just to come to you, your quick final comment that you want to leave our audience with.
Thanks, Sheldon. I think, my last kind of tip to everyone is it's tough out there. We all know it, we all experience it on a daily basis, but I think we do need to look inward and see how, what can we change? What can we do better? And a key part for me is that long-term kind of planning for organizations, because that helps with financial resilience, helps with managing the risk. Really try to integrate financial management in all areas of our organization, and really answer that question, where are we going? And what's needed by us to get to that long-term kind of vision that we do have for our organizations. Invest and really explore the kind of opportunities for partnerships and collaborations, see how we can work together to make the sector so much stronger. And then I think for the funders is Olawethu already mentioned, is really, listen to your partners. What are their gaps? What are their needs? Try to support them with long-term funding, with unrestricted funding, with their core cost, administrative cost, because that's what's going to help them to become resilient and to become sustainable in the long run as well. And I think, I just want to once again congratulate Ford Foundation for this whole initiative of weaving resilience. It was such a pleasure to work on this project where it was not support for their grantees, but any other organization that really needs it and that work in the social impact sector. And I think, I really want to ask other funders to look at that kind of opportunities moving forward, really helping the sector to become stronger.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Sarita. Fatima, your final comment for our audience.
Okay, I mean, like Sarita said, we were deeply grateful to the Ford Foundation. This support has been amazing and has allowed us to kind of revisit an organization that is 47 years old, and at a very timely, exactly at the right time. It was so timely that, it made such a big difference in how we move forward. But having said that, I think I would like funders to consider that organizations cannot continuously pour from an empty cup while responding to national crisis, and that is what organizations like Power does. We on autopilot and we respond. And my recommendation to funders and to companies is to move beyond transactional funding. I think, to invest in relationships more intentionally and to realize what is a real partnership, this helps towards building organizations' resilience. I think civil society organizations cannot create sustainable change if they are consistently operating from a place of instability and exhaustion. And that is the reality of many organizations. And I think supporting governance systems, leadership, development, and staff well-being is not separate, to the impact work. It is what makes long-term impact possible and sustainable. So I think, yes, it's good to count the numbers, but also to look at what can we do better to build this organization and to allow it to thrive. It's not just to survive. And I want us to get to that point as an organization where we can say we're thriving, and that we're not operating in crisis mode on a day-to-day. And this kind of initiatives helps us move beyond that.
Fatima, thank you very much for that. And thank you to all of my panelists Alwetu, Sarita, a special thank you to the Ford Foundation who've partnered with us and are doing the amazing work through the Weaving Resilience Initiative and have allowed us to, bring this conversation to you today. Thank you to you, our audience, who've stayed with us for today's webinar. One thing that I should have noted earlier, but to tell you, as part of our capacity building, we've got what we call the Trialogue Academy, where we have a number of courses, one of them being on fundraising, which we're due to launch, and we've got an existing one on NPO resilience. In fact, I'm going to post the link now, so it'll help you and your organization build resilience for a low cost, and it draws on our extensive research, our knowledge, insights, and case studies to help you build resilience in your own time, at your own pace as well, wherever you may be. And it's part of those efforts, to build capacity to help the development sector grow and move forward. So I'll post that now. But thank you very much for to our panelists. Thank you to you again. Please do, if you have a couple of minutes, explore some of the posts that we send. You can still stay online on the platform, and we look forward to hosting you again in June at the end of the month, the last Thursday of the month. We're looking forward to that. Please look out for your post-webinar email, which will have the write-up and full video of today's webinar, as well as our future marketing on our webinars coming up next month and for the rest of the year. So I want to thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in June.